You're listening to Say the World, an international writing podcast. I'm Mike Meginnis, the communications coordinator at the IWP.
And I'm Christopher Merrill, the longtime director of the IWP.
I threw you a curveball there.
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
We do these in batches, and so I've been saying the International Writing Program in full. You've been shortening to the acronym, and I decided I'm gonna cut him off and see where he goes.
Exactly, and where I went was straight downhill. It's what comes from long tenure in one position.
Most of this week's episode is an interview with Mary Rokonadravu, who is a fiction and nonfiction writer from Fiji. This is another episode that we recorded while you were traveling, and so this time I called in our, former colleague, soon-to-be colleague again, Natasha Derivicheva, who has been with us for a long time and recently retired and is going to be joining us again on a limited part-time basis.
She couldn't get enough of us.
She is, as you know, a very thorough person. She was a huge fan of Mary's work. And so when we get ready for these interviews, Derick puts together research notes, and then I go in and I elaborate on those, and I sort of prepare some questions on that basis, and I come to you with that printed out, and we're all professional and ready to have the conversation. And I didn't tell Natasha that I did that. So she actually came with her own document that she had prepared at some effort and length and printed out, and it had about it basically had every question I had on my list and then a few more. So this is another one where I basically was like, okay, you're in charge.
Well, and as you will quickly see, Natasha is extraordinarily bright and has this long history with the IWP, so she has an almost encyclopedic knowledge about the various ways in which we have comported ourselves through the decades.
I really enjoyed this conversation. It was the last conversation that we had for this interview series with the 2023 fall residency participants, and so it was a little bittersweet. Mary was going to be leaving soon, and I've missed her ever since.
As do I. She was really a phenomenal participant in the fall residency.
This excerpt is from Famished Eels, which was published in 2015. My sister fights the afternoon traffic to pick me up from my father's house in Nosori. I have a folder of papers and photographs in a satchel. I will tell my father about Velama and Narayana. I have reprints of photographs of Madras under the British Raj. I have photographs of the SS Jamuna. I have reprints of immigration passes. I have death certificates. I have the photograph of a copper cooking pot. But more importantly, I have 3 handwritten letters from the distant niece growing among the wheat fields of Saskatchewan. Today I wish him to meet her, a new storyteller who is yet to grow into her road, which will bring her to the edge of British Columbia, to the Pacific coast of Canada. Today I watched her recite Nudibranch names on YouTube. I closed my eyes on the 5th rerun. This girl is coming home. I listened to her growing hunger. This eel will find the great expanse of Saskatchewan too small for her. Her hunger will bring her home to the sea. The Pacific will be her black cloud. At the roundabout in Nakasi, my sister stops to refuel. I walk into the hot bread kitchen to buy 2 cream buns. My sister and I will eat these as we head into Lodala Beach Estate before the turnoff into Vatwanga and Flagstaff. I realize I have missed family. My sister licks her thumb and asks for a tissue. She has sugar grains on her nose. At the hospital, my father is behind pea green hospital curtains. The nurses have covered him. His body is growing cold. My sister has held him tightly to herself for me. She has not wept. She has not called his brothers. She has made me pack my stories into a satchel just as when we were children. She will hold my hand as we walk outside. You do realize, she will say, it is you who keep these stories after Dad. She eases the car into the hospital parking lot. I see the sun caught in a wisp of her hair. We are two eels, famished. Our black cloud awaits. I have yet to find out as I hand her the tissue for the sugar on her nose. My name is Mary Rokonadravu. I am a fiction, non-fiction, and prose poetry writer from Fiji. I think one of the important things to me in my writing is the fact that I'm of mixed heritage, so indenture Indian, settler European, and indigenous Fijian. Um, and I studied at the University of the South Pacific and had majored in history and geography, but more leaning toward history because I grew up in a town, the first capital of Fiji, which is Levuka, and it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But it was the first capital, and there was a large part of the town that I was aware of growing up that my family would not have had access to in their time, my ancestors. But I grew up with full access to it. So I was very aware of that from an early age. And I think that has had a huge impact on my writing.
What do you do on a day-to-day basis?
I work as a consultant in communications and knowledge management. My full-time work straight after university had been research into the history of my hometown, which got it inscribed into the UNESCO World Heritage List. So it was a collation of that. That was about a 20-year process, I think. But I had been in it only in the first 3 years after studies. My communications work led me to work at the University of the South Pacific, coordinate a group of Pacific writers, which does very little for writers in the Pacific, but we existed, yeah. So it's a question of funding. But my communications work led me to work in the conservation sector, in history and heritage and culture, of course, and the arts, and also in sports, in the Olympic movement, and also in all the organizations I've worked for are regional, which means they have a Pacific country membership. So the last place I'd worked on was to do with the Olympics, the Olympic movement in Oceania, so sports, but more on the politics of it and looking at it from a sustainability angle and how it makes sense to us in the region. And then the other one is called the Pacific Community, where I was communications and knowledge management advisor for an organization for its land resources division, where we looked after agriculture, forestry, biosecurity, and plant genetic resources. So all of that came into the work. So I do consultancies in communications.
Yeah, that in part explains one of the things I wanted to ask about. I'll ask the first question first, and that is, would you map Fiji for us on a kind of on the crosswinds of the various cultures that meet there? I mean, one of the reasons why your work is so interesting to read is because all of the things you just explained find their way into this incredible wealth of detail. And when one pulls back, the vision pulls back, and you look at Fiji from above, you make it appear as if though it's on a cross section of a huge variety of cultures.
Okay, if I were to map my country for you, for me, Fiji, I think if you were to talk about a layer of fabrics, for example, or if in visual art, for example, when painters prepare a board, and other colors come in, the first layer is, I think, the indigenous community, which is a few years ago, they were called Fijian. With recent politics, they're called Itoke, Fijian. There's a lot of angst about it in our country because that was done without consultation with the population, and that still exists today. Then, of course, we had European settlers who came in and deserters and beachcombers who were part of the early history. Missionaries, of course, after that, and during, simultaneously. Then the other layer were, I would say, and these races are seldom talked about, but you had Asians who came in, so Chinese, for example. But our written history does not really attribute much to them, but they were part of the fabric. And in terms of language, of course. And then we had the British rule that came in 1874. And I think I've shared it before that one of the unique things about our country is we were not invaded and colonized. Instead, we had a Fijian leader who took on the role of king, self-styled and self-proclaimed. He led the request to Britain 3 times, actually, to ask for colonization because he had debts to an American planter that he had to pay off. The planter having lost property because of a fire. I mean, the fire being set on by his own laborers who were Melanesian. So that was the background. And the British, of course, took over in 1874. And then soon after that, in 1879, we had the Indian indentured labor that came in. And that did not end until 1916. So I think these are the very critical layers that came in and which make Fiji's cultural landscape very, very complex. And then when it came to World War I and World War II, you had Fijian participation. In the First War, there was not much involvement, but we had Fijians, for example, a prominent Fijian who was in Oxford at the time, being prepared for leadership. And he wanted to take part in the war, but was not allowed, but ended up joining in the French Foreign Legion. So that's how his participation was. But in the Second World War, I think Fiji's greatest contribution had been in the Allied effort toward the war in the Pacific, which was in the Solomon Islands and all in the Pacific area, where the Japanese had come in, of course. And that is important, I would say, when we look at it historically, but we have seldom written about it. We only look at it as an event in history, but it's not studied culturally or socially. And then we gained independence in 1970. Then we had our first military coup in 1987, and there were 2 coups that year. So that led to the mass exodus of Indians out of Fiji. So at a personal level, I would say that in my immediate family, I have only 2 cousins and my brother who are still in the country. So there's only 4 households. Majority of my family are abroad in other countries. So that happened post 1987. So there were 2 coups in 1987. Then there was a civilian takeover backed by a portion of the military in 2000, and then another military coup in 2006. So it's been a wave of that, and I think that's what gives the complex layering. And I know that I talked about language on the fault lines in my first panel discussion here in Iowa. And I hadn't really gone back to review anything about my writing. All I know as a writer is that I come on and I write stories. But that was the first time I was forced to examine my writing for where it comes from. And I think I had a deeper appreciation of my own background and, the national history coming out of that. So I think in terms of layers and the cultural fabric or social fabric of my country, that would be the background. And I think I could add at this point that one of the things I find complex in my country is we've had waves of writing. The first wave came in post 68, 69 when the University of the South Pacific was set up. It's got 12 member countries. And when the university was set up, similar to Iowa, where you had the state capital moved to Des Moines and a building being given, in our case in the Pacific, where the University of the South Pacific sits now was the Royal New Zealand Air Force. The buildings were given toward the setup of a university. And most of the first wave of students that came there were coming from countries that were going through decolonization. So a lot of the literature came out of that. They were meeting for the first time. They were in an academic program and they organized themselves as writers. And most of the work that came out of that early literature was protest, about decolonization and all of that. And then straight after that, a second wave, there was French nuclear testing in the region. And of course, that had a huge response. And then one of the incidents, of course, was the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland, in New Zealand. So a lot of literature came out of those political incidents. So that was the second wave. And then in the 1990s, you had a third one, which was led by what they called the New Wave Writers Collective. And it was, again, university-based. So it slowly died out after that. By the time I was at university, we did not have writing groups. You had academics who had previously written but were not active anymore. And I know that 2 of them came here to Iowa. That was about 30 years ago. And Siona Miles and Larry Thomas. I'd read about them. And Siona had been teaching at the university when I first went into university. And Larry also, but they did not teach. I did not take their classes. But I did go through the Iowa archives after the nomination, and I came across their names and was very pleasantly surprised. But I think it was also an emotional moment for me because I went to the audio archives and had a listen to their interviews here in Iowa, and they were talking about the setting up of a Fiji Writers Association, and I've never heard of it. So, and I think this speaks to the complexity of setting up an arts group or a writing group in my country. There's very little support for it. Anything that happens out of the effort, finances, time, and energy of volunteers. If you're a writer, you must volunteer your time and you do all of these things, and it's very difficult to sustain. It's difficult to sustain, and the other layer of complexity that comes in our context is the politics is very difficult. So we've gone through waves in Fiji where, after all these political events, it's not been feasible to have a writers' association. And then, if your employment is impacted by the military activity, then you will not be a voice that will be writing or speaking about issues at all, which I think has been the case over the last 20 years for us.
Just incredibly interesting, and I see bits and pieces of the knowledge that you have just summarized here distributed across your work, which has a quality of, I would say, almost hyper realism. Almost every sentence carries a nucleus of an idea or an image or a possibility that one wants to follow through. And I have a feeling that if you kept writing, or as you will be keeping writing, each of these little anecdotes or sentences really can open up to a whole different set of ideas. In the Neighbors, I was looking at that little anecdote where the mother sits and dies quietly without you ever mentioning the word death in the Chinese bakery, even while the coup is happening outside, but where everybody approaches it as a matter of course. It's simply, that's yet another coup. This is what we do. This is how we wait out. And you have a feeling of there being a historical moment that opens up that one just waits to come back in some other form. Similarly, this is the second of my two big questions. One of the many interesting things, but growing out of the same writing style and the same intellectual style, I would want to say, is your description of the natural landscape, which is so close to the cultural landscape, and the kind of interweaving of nature and the way in which men and women handle what nature is providing for them. There's kind of an immediacy in the stories. I wonder, do you want to say something about how nature, which must be, how could it not be immediate, how that figures in your head so that it comes out in the stories in the way in which it does?
Mhm. Um, Thank you for that question, Natasha. So I would say how nature seeps into my writing and why probably I spend time covering it. I grew up in a very isolated place. We had my family, those that adopted me, they had a huge copra estate, which was about, before it was broken up. I mean, it was about 700 or 800 acres. And my grandfather, post indenture, and his mother had worked to purchase that. It was part of the original estate that they had come in to serve their indenture in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s. And after he had served that period, I think because he came in as a child, he was about 11 when he came into Fiji with his mother. Because he had been a child and he had a good relationship with the planter's wife because he served in the kitchen. We know that in our oral history in the family. I think the lady helped him to purchase that part of the estate quite cheaply because it was wilderness. It hadn't been cleared for coconut planting. So he had bought that, and he had three daughters, my mom and her two sisters. And their childhood, when they talk about their childhood in the family, it's about getting the land cleared. And they remember laying out fishing lines and measuring out the land in grids in order to plant coconut. So they raised it, the whole estate. And I grew up on that. Of course, I didn't know this history as a child. I learned it much later as a teenager. So that piece of land, I think, had a huge impact on me, particularly because it was childhood. I grew up there. My sense of security stems from that. We had workers on the estate who were indigenous Fijians, Etoke. They were very much part of the family, so it was not like they were providing labor or anything like that. They were members of the family. Yeah, so on that copra estate, I think there was no issue. I don't know how they felt, but from my perspective as a kid, and even now, the people who worked on the property with my grandmother and my grandfather, and then down to my parents, were always members of my family. And even though we sold the property about 2 decades ago, these people still remain part of our family, even though we've moved into other parts of the country, like separated. So I would say when it comes to nature and my sense of biodiversity or the world out there, it's very much from this. And right by the coast and then moving inland. So varying landscapes. And I think if there's any sense of something primitive about and untouched or pristine about land, it comes from that. And you know how when we write, it's not a particularly real place unless it's specifically mentioned. But I think we get patchworks of little images from throughout our life, and we put that together in a package. I think that's what I did in the Night Watch, and that's what I did in Famished Eels. And invariably, all these memories come in and provide a particular backdrop. And the most impactful for me was where I grew up. So the name of the estate is Tulani. It's on the island of Koro. It's right in the middle of Fiji. Historically, after the mutiny on the Bounty, Captain William Bligh sailed through Lomaiviti waters, which is where these islands are. That's how he found his way to Timor, where they found rescue and all of that. In the natural world, this is the pathway of whales, which is why I think I do pay attention to whales in some of my writing. So during whaling season, and that's where the whaling history comes through, because American whalers and others from other parts of the world did go through to get provisions on the way to Antarctic whaling grounds south of New Zealand. So that part for me is huge. Most people don't know this, but even though we don't have extreme seasonal changes, Fiji does experience a winter, a drop in temperatures. So for us, that weather change, the rich what do you call it, the rich botanical heritage, and then of course current and even agricultural in terms of cropping, all of that. Now I pay attention to that because I come from that background. Yeah. And when I went into Levuka and was first introduced to a library when in my third year of school, I don't think I ever walked out of the library at all until today. You're always in it. So I've always treated the library and archives as when I first did it, it was not for writing. But then when I began writing, all this wealth of information, I think, was ready and ripe to constantly find its way into my writing. So that became very important for me in terms of both the natural world and, all of this afterward. So one example that I can give is I'd experienced all of this, the natural world out there in isolation, and then coming into other islands in Fiji and then having an eye for it. And then when I began reading historical books, not for history at all, just for leisure, then I'm reading about botanists that came and botanists whose reports were important to getting Fiji colonized. And then botanists who were part of US naval expeditions that were coming to my country. It was not the British who came. It was the US naval expedition that was charged with the responsibility of finding out whether, certain plants or plant species could be exploited for commerce, and what the soil and climate was like, what crops it would be good for. So all of this that came into it. Yeah, so I would say that's how nature comes into it.
Yeah, and nature always carries a trail behind it, and you know that the hook will be to another event that will happen, including things like pollution, destruction of the natural environment. So history weaves itself through nature, and nature weaves itself through history in really kind of a remarkable way. But since you brought up yet another topic that is so obviously relevant for you, the archive, I'm curious about how you imagine in your own how your writing mediates between the oral history, which you always seem to be alluding to. People not only are people storytellers, but you yourself are characters in your stories, often comment on or think about how information or knowledge carries between 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. It's always about these networks of things that have to do with oral culture, but then they are encapsulated, captured by writing. Often fictionally, there's a pretext that, it's somebody who is a researcher or somebody who has a diary or something like that. But in your own head, you seem to be, in a way, the oral historian in your own work, I should say. I'm wondering about what's in your head, but in your work, you seem to be a mediator between the oral history and fiction, and perhaps nonfiction that is actual science or historical description. Where does the orality part fit in, and where does the writing part fit in as you sit in front of a sheet of paper or a keyboard?
For me, when I arrive at the paper and even at the computer, the only thing that I have is the story, in my head when I begin, and then of course as it moves forward, the story begins to tell itself. Is how I would explain it. I have little control over that, but I do have some choices, of course, like in events, which comes in the second draft and all of that. But listening to your question, I know that these three things come in. The oral history part, the written part, and then the archival or the science part that comes in. Now, when I move further into the writing, and I usually feel that I have not paid enough attention to it, and I think many writers probably feel that way. That even when you put out something, it's never ready. But at some point you have to cut that umbilical cord, and let it out. I mean, let it go out into the world. I know that I've talked about it here with other writers who've asked me similar questions because of the detail that goes into the writing and how the characters are talking about, oral storytelling themselves and how they're imparting knowledge and information. I think I do that because it probably happens in real life, I would say, with me. Because Indians felt that they were a marginal community in Fiji, they did not have rights that the first people had. This is, I think it continued until probably 2016 or something, or 2006. The storytelling portion was so important. And I think because take my parents, for example. My parents were first generation Indians born in Fiji. Their parents came from India. So I sense that a lot of what is not discussed in the indenture experience in Fiji in particular, maybe in other regions it's different. In Fiji, we've completely been cut off from Britain, is how I would put it. Because you look at the Caribbean, you look at the African continent, you look at South America, even, British Guiana and all of that, they have some sort of a relationship with Britain. So you have a large part of the populations, the Indian population there, that have a presence in Britain, and there's a relationship. In Fiji, there is nothing of the sort. So I think Indians in Fiji have a sense of abandonment that comes from there. I'm not saying that they say this. I'm saying it is my observation from my family experience. And in that case, there's two things that happen. One is they no longer tell stories to explain where they came from. It's hushed up, and you create this new identity. I've had a sense of that. But what I do know is it matters who you're close to. And because I was close to my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she was the one who told me stories. And in a similar fashion, it was my father who did that with me. And the third thing is, I think it matters who has interest in a family about storytelling or about knowing about the family. I know that in my family, I was the only one who was asking questions, and consistently since childhood, just as a point of interest. I wanted to know things, and that's where that set in. So I think everything that I collected over the years, my love for reading, my love for archives and libraries. I mean, the first was the library, and naturally the transition then goes into museums and archives. So I'm a huge fan of museums. I'm a huge fan of archives, even art and art galleries. And then, of course, I love listening to people talk about themselves and about their life experience.
Which allows me to segue to another thing which I was hoping we would cover, and that is oral history, or oral histories must have been so important in the years you worked with the Prison Writing Project. And I'm hoping that you will eventually be able to say a few words about that as well.
Thank you, Natasha. So a few strange things about the prison writing program. So I was at USP, the university, and with the Pacific Writing Forum, and the prison commissioner. We just had a military coup in 2006, December 2006. And in 2007, when the university opened in February, we had a midway through the year, we had a request from the head of the corrections of the prisons department, who had become, he was in the military, he'd become become head of the, the prisons service. And his way of coming into the new role, because he'd had no experience with prisons, and his way of coming into the role was to travel to 3 countries where rehabilitation was working. And at that time, in 2007, 2006, 7, the best rehab programs for corrections were working in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and one other country, which I forget. But so he got his leadership team and came to Hong Kong and Singapore. In Singapore, I think he had a very, what do you call it, a mind blowing experience as far as his reviewing the rehab program that was going there. And he encountered 2 arts programs. One was a visual art program that Singapore prisons were running under what they were calling the Yellow Ribbon Project. The other one was a life writing program. So he wanted that. So he came back to Fiji, asked around about creative writing, and there was nothing going on, even at the university. So what he asked for was for someone who could come into the prisons. There are 7 in the capital, to offer a creative writing program, but he wanted someone who could speak the 3 languages, the main ones. The 3 languages were Hindi, Fiji Hindi, English, Itoke Fijian, and I normally put in the 4th one, which is that Creole kind of what they call a half caste or Kailoma language in Fiji, and in some places they call it broken English. So these 4. So I was the only one who could offer it. So it fell on me to go and run the program. So there was no curriculum, and I had to design that and offer it at the same time. So that's what I did for about 5 years. But life writing played, of course, a huge role in it, oral storytelling. But in Fiji's case, because we've had all this military history, and in the last coup, in the previous 3, you could feel that it was indigenous Fijian, and then you had the Indian population here. But in a strange twist, the one that happened in 2006, it was the indigenous community itself that felt marginalized, even though it was led by indigenous Fijians. So there was that sense of complexity or awkwardness about it, and most of the, I would say, the offenders who went through the program had to navigate that. But yes, life stories played a huge role in it, and as usual, because it's difficult for, well, they'd never written actually. I mean, they knew how to read and write, but they'd never written. So in that way, it was a very raw group to work with. The second thing is I did allow illiterate offenders to enter the program. And for them, they had a weekly journal to do, plus other exercises that I ran with them. In the weekly journal, instead of the writing part, they could either respond through visual art in their art journal, or they could record themselves, their journal entries, and in whatever language they wanted. And ironically enough, I had a student who did it in Spanish and 2 in Mandarin Chinese, but it was their embassies or high commissions in Australia that did translation for us. Yeah. So that's how that program worked. But in terms of life writing, the last thing, because they wouldn't come out in writing, I'd say the first 2 to 3 months, I ran the class in oral fashion. So everything was oral before they would go into writing. That was one. And the other one, you used the word mapping a while ago, but it was for another question. But in terms of mapping, the way they got into the life writing was the mapping of scars and tattoos. Tattoos, of course, very physical, and scarring in terms of scars they had on their bodies, which then went on to scars culturally in their cultural landscape, spiritual or emotional ones. And that's how everything unraveled for them. And I'm glad that you asked the question, because while here in Iowa, one of my projects had been to um, put together the curriculum that I had designed.
So I'm sorry we didn't make it this year to visit with the Oakdale prison facilities, because some years we've had our writers go and visit there.
Okay.
And but the security issues are always take up a lot of time.
That's it, yeah. But they did have a reading of the prison writing project here at Prairie Lights, yeah.
Is there a particular goal that you have for the materials that you've been assembling from the curriculum there? Are you hoping to do something with that when you go back?
I was actually asked to because a lot of people know about the program. It had been submitted and identified as a best practice years ago in 2009, which is more than a decade ago. But I'd been asked to compile it because other people were interested in using it in other countries. So I had been contacted by people who were running rehabilitation or arts-based programs in New Zealand, for example, but among what they call Pacifica and Maori communities, offenders, and the same for other Pacific Island countries. Because it's not the same rehab programs that work, of course, in the West that would work for our context. So in that way, it's contextualized.
Right. Well, and it's debatable whether any rehab programs in the West are useful to anyone. We don't do great in this regard. So I'm sure even so we'd have a lot to learn from that. But that's really great that do you mind if I ask, is there a particular like organization or folks that are hoping to put this into action, or is this just a more general interest?
See, we do not have proper, what do you call it, organizations that, I mean, registered organizations that do rehab back in my country. But what we do have is passionate individuals who've been working through organizations, which are not necessarily rehab focused organizations. So it would be these people. Now, here in Iowa, among the writers, I've had interest from other writers who want to see how those workshops ran because they want to apply it probably to their context or to look at it and see how they can recontextualize that for their own settings and not necessarily for offender rehabilitation only, but for other areas, yeah, other target groups that they work with.
What other things have I just want you to talk a little bit more about the IWP landscape, the way it responded to you, the way in which you were able to get things out of it, the way in which the whole experience has kind of it's almost, I mean, we're three-quarters done, more than that. You can start looking in retrospect. As you write in one of your stories, you say, in fact, in the section that you were reading, she will have soon. You talk about your sister going. She will have gone out of the room. In other words, you write in a future tense, looking backwards, and that seems to me to be a grammatical trick that you use often to tie together the future and the past. So use that "she will have" trope for me, talking about IWP.
Okay. Um, when I came, when it was confirmed I was coming, I put together several things that I wanted to complete while I was here. I managed to complete, I would say, 75% of it, so I'm really happy with it. Yes. So there were a couple of things that I wanted to do. I've been writing for about 30 years, but not done nothing much about publishing. I had just sent it to the Commonwealth short story competition, and won 2 for the region, and then 1 shortlist. But I hadn't really invested time and effort into other opportunities. So when I came here, I knew that I wanted to do several of those things. One is to put together a short story collection. So I've done that. I've put together a short story collection, finalizing and combining old and new stuff. And I've written new material here. And it's strange because in my first 2 weeks in IWP, I finished 3 short stories. So that was, I think, a huge boost about coming here. And I was just sharing with a friend of mine back home that I'd always argued to myself that I would always, as a writer, remain in Fiji because I didn't feel that I would be able to write in another setting. That the sense of place is so important to me that I have to be connected to the space. And Iowa proved me wrong because one of the things I shared, and I shared in an interview just this week, also back home, is that the amount of writing I've done in Iowa through the IWP, I haven't done over the last 10 years. It surpasses even that. So that has been, I think, for me, the biggest surprise about coming to Iowa in terms of productivity and creativity and getting thoughts organized and all of that. So I finished the short story collection. I began a novel here, and I'm through about 60% of it. And I'm halfway through a collection of nonfiction essays. So three sets. And then I had the opportunity to go back and collect prose poetry and write a few new ones and get old ones and put it together in place. So I think over the 11-week, 12-week period, I would say 12 because of the prep that we do before coming, and then even after, like extending that. What I've managed to achieve here, um, I would never have dreamt possible even before coming. Yeah. So the space had been important in that regard. But I think a couple of other things that the IWP has provided me with. One is the networking with other writers. And I'm not saying networking in terms of opportunities, it's not that. It's what we get from other writers, from their experiences, and reading their texts and listening to them talk through their text and and the analysis of their work and their realities. I think that is probably the biggest gift, one of the biggest. And this has come, of course, through the panel discussions that we have at ICPL, the readings both at Prairie Lights and Shambo House here, and of course, the other organic conversations we have over breakfast or over meals or simply just walking to venues and other destinations, including Chicago, and I'm sure in New York in the coming week. But it's that sense of fertilization, cross fertilization.
Really remarkable amount of writing that you did. Does it all pertain to Fiji? In other words, is it a retrieval of what was in your head, stored up and waiting to be formalized, or the local landscape also, whether it's human or natural or political or cultural landscape, find its way into what you've been writing here?
Oh no, sorry. When I meant the new material, I mean a large part of it is associated with here, this landscape. And the other thing that I'd done is done the Stanley Art Museum early on and then afterward. So there's material that came out of that, and a larger piece that I know I will take back home and extend. And then I think for me, one of the most mind-blowing experiences I've had is with the Museum of Natural History. So I had contacted them, and they personalized a tour for me. So I went to see their not only the exhibition but their collections, and they took me through samples or work, that they had engaged in an exchange with in the 1800s, and then in the 1940s and 50s. So they had exchanged material at the Natural Museum. There's birds, insects that I'm seeing here that are on the verge of extinction, for example, in New Zealand and Australia. So that was a huge thing. And you are right. So because I write so much about nature, so I have a set on insects, a set on birds, but short stories, essay, but particularly the essays.
Giant sloth.
Oh yeah, I did meet.
Well, that's amazing to hear. When we ask folks what they're doing here, of course, a lot of people say what I think I would say, which is like, actually, I didn't know writing here. Like, I suspect that I would be in the set that comes here and has all the best intentions and plans to write some sort of big project, and then instead spends the entire time sort of absorbing everything and talking to people and just trusting that at some point in the future I'll be able to process it and work on it. And that's great when people have that experience. But of course, we can't help but be a little more excited when somebody does what you're describing, where it's like, yeah, actually, I wrote an incredible amount. Like that's the best case scenario. So I'm so glad to hear that.
And about local insects from 1800. I mean, that is just wonderful. Have you had a chance to go to the special collections and look at the files of the two Fijian writers who were here in the 70s and 80s?
Actually, no, I haven't done that.
Okay.
But I will. But I will.
Yeah.
But I did, before coming, I had actually contacted both of them and had asked for samples of their writing or books that I could bring over for the library. And that didn't pan out because either one was a meeting that didn't happen in the end, and the second one, all his work was out of print. Yeah, but I did mention that it could be sent to the Iowa Library here. However, with one of them, and I hope to write an essay on it when I'm back home, combining my experience here and theirs. He did talk about how he had gone back to Fiji. This is Larry Thomas, and how he had a significant amount of work that came out after, post Iowa experience. And Mike, by the way, if I could to add to what you're saying, I didn't expect to do writing when I came. I knew that I would be doing a little bit of writing and combining it with the retrieved writing, bringing it forward and collating stuff. But so that was a pleasant surprise for me even. However, I do know this also. Everything that even I have gathered here, like other writers, I think it's going to find its way into other projects, into other writing in very different ways over many years. Because you know how we are as writers. I don't suspect we use everything at once.
You've described your experience here as incredibly profitable in the sense of mobilizing the material you had and things that surrounded you and your own research, because that's really what you are. You're a researcher who also happens to write brilliantly. But I was curious about whether, on a kind of a human and personal level, whether there was a particular set of ideas or inspiration that may have come out from either a particular writer, without necessarily naming names, or a particular region, or a particular style of writing, or an approach to creativity?
So I'd read a considerable amount of the writing samples of other writers before coming, and researched a few of them. But coming here to Iowa and engaging with them, I hadn't, you read the classics, the big names from Latin America, for example. But coming here, and meeting writers like Maricela Guerrero and Cecilia Martha Ruiz, from Nicaragua, and going through because I'd never heard of them or gone through their work before. So I read the samples, but then what I read is further translations of their work that happened while they were here. And I think I've never felt before the sense of urgency. I think for me, when I encountered these writers' works, I have a sense of urgency for them. They need to be translated and brought into the English language, into the Anglophone, to Anglophone readers, because their work is so rich and different. For me, it provides a deeper and better understanding of Central and Latin America and their cultures, the landscapes, and the pressing issues that they face. So that was one, I would say, and that has really enriched me. Second is, I think the deeper experience I've had here, and in my sensibility as both I call myself a writer. Never. I wouldn't say I'm an activist, but in terms of translation, seeing how translation works here in Iowa and what it does to, what could be invisible writing or from difficult spaces and all of that, how important translation is, and attending, of course, the Spivak lecture, which we thoroughly enjoyed, and listening to her and then equating it to how translation works in this space. In my region, we never ever talk about translation. Just for a linguistics or language department to still exist at a university, at a regional university, extremely difficult, resourcing, to justify resourcing, you go through so many layers of administrative issues, and then in the move to corporatization, because in our region, of course, the regional university is undergoing corporatization like many other universities, I suspect. But then these are subject areas that are seldom supported, seldom justified to exist or expand or anything. But there's an incredible legacy here. And I think meeting the foreign language writers and seeing how they are brought into the English language and what a difference it makes to their careers. But then I think we usually talk as readers where, oh, okay, so this one got translated and it's important. And it's as if a favor is being done to the writer who is writing in a foreign language, but we seldom think about how much we are enriched, and it's us who benefit more as readers. It's not the writer, it's not the translator. It's really us and generations after us who will have access to this beautiful work. And that's something we don't talk about in our region. But seeing it here, I think that has given me such a deeper and bigger perspective on how translation works and how important it is. And I know that even while here, I have contacted people back home, people I would never have prior coming to Iowa talk to, or have significant interest about or for. And it's in the translation department in linguistics, and that's something I want to explore, how they work it and what are the issues that they face and all of that. Because I was at the university during the corporatization process, I saw how corporatization comes in and begins to put a monetary value or to monetize things, and how I think corporatization succeeds because it forces departments and institutions and colleges and schools to be more insular, because you have to protect your funding sources, for example. You have to compete for funding. You have to compete for resourcing, everything, on what the curriculum is or syllabus, for example. You have arguments over that. And I saw that happen where I was. So, and I just wanted to say there's something else happening in the US now, which brings me to this conversation about what happened at the University of the South Pacific. I think when the corporatization model came in, and departments, you no longer had a curriculum or a program, an academic program that was multidisciplinary in nature, where you could do both sciences and humanities, for example, or the arts or something like that. So it became very focused in different subject areas, and that was, I think, a tremendous loss. If a person like me, for example, wanted to do a combination of both, there was never any way. So you would do, for example, an entire program of courses, but then it would not end up in a formal degree because it's outside the purview of that, which is very, very specific to the subject matter. And I think over the last 2 weeks, there's been something on social media, and I'd been following it for a while, which is an example. So the Gettysburg Review, which is in Gettysburg College, and I saw that come up on my timeline on Twitter, and I've been tweeting about it. And I took that and put it in our WhatsApp group for writers. And I noticed how little attention it got on the WhatsApp group, because what I was asking for was for people to actually sign the petition to support it. Now, why is that important for me as a fiction writer? It's important because it's a literary magazine. It's being cut out like immediately with no discussion in a college in America. So when I think about my engagement in America, how could it be meaningful, as invisible as it would be? It would be to just get online and sign a petition. And what's ironic is just 2 days ago, I think, or yesterday, the Gettysburg Review also put up another post where there's a meeting of 6 other journals, or magazines within the university. But of course, they're not invited to that meeting because they've been cut out. And so they've got these petitions going. What it shows me is that I don't know, in the literary community or in the arts and humanities, that solidarity or taking a position is important. If I were running a magazine, for example, in a university, and I know probably I would lose my job over it, but if another university, another journal or magazine is being threatened with a shutdown or lower resourcing and all of that, it would be important for me to, one, publicly show solidarity. That's one. The second thing is you have to do everything administratively possible or innovatively possible to make sure that that sister publication or that sister program is enriched and still running. And the way that the humanities is always weakened is because we're forced to divide ourselves up. And we do not have the imagination, I think. We usually lack it because we're competing for funding or attention in the university system or something like that. And it puts us in a very weakened and bad position. And I posted about it on X now, not Twitter, on X last night, because I said that it's a pity because those 6 journals who are not supporting the Gettysburg Review, that their day will come too. And what they will find, is that probably no one will stand for them as well, just the way they are now with this literary magazine that is going down.
Thank you. Wonderful interview. I knew I was right to want to sit in on this one. So
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Say the World, an international writing podcast, is a production of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. IWP programming is primarily funded by the University of Iowa and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, with additional funding provided by organizations like the Doris Duke Foundation, as well as donors like you. If you'd like to donate to the IWP, go to bit.ly/IWP-support. Links to further information and additional credits for this episode are in the show notes.